All right, so we've got one more 60s era president that we are going to take a look at, and that is Mr. Richard Nixon. You've probably heard of Richard Nixon, but chances are what you've heard about him isn't very good. His reputation in American history is not the best. He's our only president ever to resign his office, and we'll get to what's going on there. But lost in all of that are some very good things that he did in American history. So we're going to look at hopefully a little bit of the totality of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, as a young man, was Vice President of the United States. That image that you see there on the left. We are much more familiar with the image on the right, right? Him giving the dual peace signs, getting onto Marine One there, the president's helicopter, or him giving the famous "I am not a crook" speech. I'm going to link that for you, or a clip of that on the playlist after these notes are over with. Um, he got his start in World War II, serves his country, comes back, gets himself elected to Congress. He's from the state of California. Interesting connection, kind of locally though, is his mom was actually from North Vernon, Indiana, and so kind of a little bit of a local connection there. He's from California, gets himself elected to the House of Representatives, and starts to make a name for himself as being someone who is extremely tough on communism. And so obviously that was one of the big issues at the time. And so that was a way of making a name for himself. It his youth and his experience with domestic issues made him an ideal candidate for vice president when Dwight Eisenhower decides he's going to run in 1952. Remember talking about Ike, he'd spent an awful lot of time overseas, a little bit of an older guy, and so Nixon was going to help kind of balance out that ticket. There's a little bit of early political controversy. He's accused by some of his political enemies of basically accepting money illegally in campaign funds and things. He has to give a really famous speech called the Checkers speech to get himself out of trouble. And I'll link that video for you at the end. But he'll be vice president of the United States for 8 years. And then when 1960 rolls around, it's his turn. He's going to run for president. Believe it or not, being vice president is a really lousy way to get to be president, especially if you're running after your 2 terms as vice president. Because usually after 8 years, people are wanting a little bit of a change, and so that's not nearly the path to the presidency that you might think that it is. We already talked in the Kennedy notes about how he engaged in the first televised debates with President Kennedy, and he loses a really close election to Kennedy. He goes home to California, runs for governor, loses that election too in 1962. Basically talks to the press and says, "You're not going to have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. I'm going to go do something else. My political career is over with." And in 1962, most people would have agreed with him. What's going to happen though is in 1968, the presidential election is a mess. President Johnson comes out and says he's not going to run for president, which creates kind of a vacuum on the side of the Democrats. Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's little brother, comes to run, but he's assassinated right after the primary in California, and so he's not there. And so there's just a big hole, right? And Richard Nixon sees his chance. He gets the Republican nomination and wins. And one of his campaign promises is he's going to bring peace with honor to the Vietnam War. And so Vietnam had been going on really in earnest since 1964. And so it's four years into the war, he promises he's going to end that conflict. Sad part is that conflict won't end actually until he's out of office. As he comes in, we'll see we're doing the Vietnam stuff. Didn't really have a great idea of how we were going to get out of the Vietnam War. President Nixon had a plan for what he was going to do. He was going to replace troops from the United States with troops we were going to train from South Vietnam. He called the idea of Vietnamization. We're basically going to train our own replacements and get these guys to where they could take care of themselves. A couple other highlights of his presidency: he takes us off the gold standard, which, if you're an economics person, is a big deal. He signs some of the first nuclear limitation treaties, the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, with the Soviet Union. So actually kind of backs down tension between those two countries. And probably most famously, one of the biggest things he does is he opens up China to the West. He becomes the first sitting U.S. president to go to China. China had been our ally, right? But then they flipped over to Team Communist in the 1950s, and so the relationship had been rocky. He goes over to China, still a communist country, but they were not really good friends with the Soviet Union, so he saw a chance to kind of further drive a wedge between those countries. And so I got a great video I'll link for you here with his trip to China. You'll see him here. I love this picture. Elvis actually visited Nixon in the Oval Office and basically said, "Hey, I'm around the country all the time. People think I'm pretty hip. Deputize me into the FBI, and I'll be a secret agent for you, going around the country." Kind of a trippy exchange. Elvis never got his badge and his gun, but he sure tried. The thing that's going to get Richard Nixon is what becomes known in history as Watergate. Now, Watergate is just the name of this hotel that's there in Washington, D.C. It doesn't even exist in this form anymore. They tore it down. But if you've seen the scene in Forrest Gump, right, when he greets President Nixon, one of the things Nixon does is puts him up in the Watergate Hotel. Well, the Watergate Hotel also had office space in there, and that was the headquarters of the Democratic National Party, right? And so they're doing the election stuff and the build up to the 1972 election. There are a group of Republicans who break in to this office, tap the phones, take pictures of documents, things like that, but they get caught. And it links back, and these guys are all Republicans working for political people, so it just doesn't look very good. And it wasn't that Nixon needed help. Nixon's going to win re-election really easily in 1972. It was more kind of the down the ticket elections that are there. But Nixon proceeds to try and cover up the crime, use the power of the presidency to cover up what had happened. Basically starts out with just kind of the idea of asking for a favor, saying, "Hey, let this go away." Well, the problem was there was recording equipment in the Oval Office, and so as people start to investigate this crime, they subpoena those tapes. He goes through some spells of saying, "Well, there's executive stuff on there. You can't hear all that stuff," and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, "No, you have to turn this stuff over." And when you hear the recordings, the American people hear kind of a darker side of Nixon, coarse language, talking bad about people, just not sounding real presidential. And he starts to see public opinion turn against him. He gives a famous speech where he basically says, "I'm not a crook," but in this instance, he's trying to use the power of the presidency to stop an investigation. He kind of was. So it looks like he's going to be impeached, and he makes the decision before he can be impeached that he's going to resign his office. And so Nixon will resign. He gives a famous series of interviews later to a British interviewer named David Frost. A couple of years ago, the movie Frost versus Nixon was a big one. It started out as a stage play, and they did it in movie form. It was up for Best Picture, and Frank Langella was playing Nixon in it. Really cool movie if you like the political type of stuff. I got a copy. I know this is going to come as a huge shock in the film library, but I'm sure you could find it somewhere to stream as well. But basically, a couple years after all this stuff, David Frost gets Nixon on there. Nixon admits that what he did was wrong. He lives until the 1990s. Got a presidential library out there in California, but is never kind of able to escape the shadow of Watergate and get back into kind of acclaimed public life. But like I said, there's a lot of stuff this guy does that's that's good and has an effect on the world that you and I live in today. But because of that, he doesn't necessarily um, get the respect for that. So that's a little bit with Richard Nixon. Like I said, check out some of these videos I'm going to stick in this playlist after this, and give you some different resources to let you look at this. I'll see if I can find something. He's present with the moon landing, talks to the astronauts. Just a lot of neat stuff that goes on during this time period. Um, he's going to eventually, troops in Vietnam will be withdrawn at the end of the Nixon administration. Um, and so there's a lot of different moving parts. I said the sad part is Watergate just kind of takes up everything.